In this video, we're going to see how your computer is understanding and running your JavaScript code. So let's say this is your JavaScript file. Now your computer does not have any idea what this is. Okay. It's like say you speak English and I speak Hindi. Now say I don't understand a letter of English. So if some English guy comes to me and tells me to do something, he has to bring some translator with him, and that translator will translate that English to Hindi. Then I will understand that and would be able to perform the task. Now, similar thing is happening with your computer. It does not know what JavaScript is. Okay, it only knows binaries, means zeros and ones. So there's a translator sitting in between them who is translating the code you write to machine code or binaries that a computer can understand. So this translator is called an interpreter for JavaScript. Okay. The fun thing is this interpreter is also a program which is written by some other developers. Okay. This interpreter will check your syntax, and if any syntax error is there, it will catch that and inform that to you. Now we will see step by step process of how this interpreter is parsing your code, how the JavaScript engine is running your code, everything. So when you run the code, the first, a global execution context is created. Okay. Now, what is an execution context? You can think like this. Say you want to cook a meal for yourself. Now, you don't start cooking in your bedroom, right? You go to the kitchen and in there you perform any cooking related task. So there's a boundary in the house where you prepare your meal, that is the kitchen. The related utilities kept there and you can use them when you are using that boundary. Now, when the engine is executing your code, it creates a logical boundary as well. You can think like in that boundary, it has some amount of RAM to store the variables, it has some amount of processor to execute your code. This thing is isolated from rest of the operation that is happening inside your computer. Okay. So an execution context is where your code is running. And inside that execution context, you have three partitions. One is for storing the variables. Okay. One part is for storing the reference variable of another execution context. We'll understand this part very broadly in future. Don't worry about it right now. Okay. And the final part is for executing your code line by line. Now, this line by line thing is important here. Maybe you have heard of the term called single threaded. So, JavaScript is a synchronous and single threaded language. That means it can only perform one task at a time. Now, maybe you are also familiar with the thing called asynchronous JavaScript and Ajax. And I am telling you that JavaScript is a synchronous language. So there's a conflict here, right? So in our upcoming videos, we will see that the synchronous thing is the feature of our browser that is nothing to do with the JavaScript language. So you just remember this. JavaScript is a synchronous single-threaded language. Means it will only perform one task at a time. Means one line of code at a time. Now, when you start your JavaScript application or open a web page inside your browser, a global execution context is created for you. And for every function that is called inside your code, another little brand new execution context is created for that function as well. So let's get back to the code and we'll be emulating the JavaScript engine and see how the engine is parsing the code and running the code and what changes are happening in the memory, all these things. Okay. So you are submitting this app.js file to your JavaScript engine. Now to run this file, JS engine will follow a two-step process every time. First, it will line by line parse the code and then it will execute the code line by line. So first the parsing phase and then the execution phase. Okay, so let's see the parsing phase. So we are in the first line. Now in the parsing phase, the engine will just recognize the variables and functions. So we have a variable called name. In the second line, we have a function. Now a function is just a block of code that will be stored in the memory and it will run if the function is called at a later time, right? So we have a function named greet. Okay. Now the parsing phase is complete. Let's see the execution phase now. So in the first line, we are assigning a string John Doe to the variable name. Then in the second line, there is nothing to execute for the engine because we are just having a function and that is a block of code. And unless we call that function, nothing will happen. So the job is done. Let's say another example. This is the code block. Now in the parsing phase, in line on, we have a variable called person. In the second line, we have a function named say hello. Okay. In this line, we have another variable named I. So there is no other variable or function for the global execution context. So let's come to the execution phase. In the first line, person is getting assigned to the string Bob. Then in the second line, nothing to execute because that's just a function block. Then we are having a for loop and we set the initial value of I to 0. Now the for loop will be started, and in every iteration, the value of I will be increased by 1 and a console log is happening. Okay. So when the for loop is completed, the value of I will be 10. Now in the next line, the function say hello is called. Okay. Now how do you differentiate between calling a function and declaring a function? Whenever you are putting a pair of parentheses after the function, that means you are calling that function. Okay. So as you know, for every function called, there will be a brand new execution context. And in that execution context, there will be a passing phase and an execution phase as well. So a brand new execution context is created. In the parsing phase, we have the first variable called person name. Now this person name is called a parameter, but it is just another variable. Okay. And in the second line, we have a variable called grid. Let's come to the execution phase now. Now, do you know what's the difference between a parameter and an argument? Function parameters are names that are listed on the function definition. Okay, in our case, that is this person name. And the argument is whatever value you're passing to the function when you are calling it. So when we're calling the function say hello, we're passing the value of person as an argument to the parameter name person name. So let me say that again. We pass an argument to the parameter when we call the function. Okay. So let's get back to the execution context again. So for a function in the execution phase, this person name variable or a parameter will be initiated whatever is passed as an argument during calling the function. That is the string Bob for us. Okay. In the next line, we are assigning a string hello to the grid. And in the final line, we are console logging those two strings. And the function execution is over. So the execution context will be deleted and the thread will go back to the previous execution context. So what do I mean by this thread will go back to the previous execution context? Let me introduce you to a new term called call stack. So this JavaScript engine is keeping track of all the execution context with the help of a stack. Now a stack is what it sounds like, right? Means on top of another. So the thread was inside the global execution context. Means the code sitting inside the global execution context was running. Now a function is called, a new execution context is created, and that is placed on top of the global execution context. Now whatever context is on the top of the stack, that is running. So in our case, the say hello function is running when that is on the top of the stack. Now we call some other function inside the say hello function. In our case, we called the console log function, right? So that was on the top. Now after the console log is done, that is popped up the stack and the control comes to say hello function. After completion of that as well, that is also popped up the stack. Now the global execution context is on the top of the stack. So the control comes to there again. And in our global execution context, the next line is this line. And again, a function call is there. So new execution context will be created. And after logging is done, that will be popped up the stack. And global execution context is also over because there is no more code. So the job is done. So that was all for this video. In the upcoming videos, we're going to see many more concepts like what is an object in JavaScript, what is a closure, this kind of things. And if you think you learned something from this video, consider subscribing to this channel and I will see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.